Jamie.
Thanks very much, Ken. Well, it's great to be here to talk about rye. How many people here have grown rye on their farm, just out of curiosity? Well, there's quite a few. How many have hybrid rye in now or have looked at it? Okay, no, that's good. Yeah, so this I'm going to go over basically, we have an agronomy project. Ken, myself, and a few other collaborators across Western Canada have an agronomy project out. This is the first year data, okay, so we'll take a look at it and hopefully you'll gain a little bit of understanding. You know, project isn't completed, we don't have the full data set assembled, so I think there are some things to learn at, but ultimately when we get enough site years in here, I think we'll be able to conclude pretty concretely a little bit more understanding about open pollinated rye versus hybrid rye. So I'm just going to give you just the outline of things. So I'm going to go through the background, kind of, you know, learning a little bit about rye in Western Canada, why there's reasons for optimism. So then I'm going to talk about basically the project. So the agronomy project we have out in the field we seeded last year, have this year's data that we put in the fall and again this fall. So just the comparisons from a yield perspective between open pollinated hybrid rye and then looking at those yield comparisons between the two also under conventional, or what I term as a conventional management system versus a more intensive management system. I'll go through those treatments. We can take a look at that. So I'll talk about also the experimental setup, the grain yield component analysis, some grain quality analysis, and then I'll kind of sum everything up. So looking at this is taken from notes from the Prairie Recommending Committee. So there's a survey done on rye. I believe this is 1957. And so each one of those points kind of equates to 1,000 acres of rye. So if you look at it, there was a lot of rye grown in Western Canada in 1957. It's pretty interesting to note where it's grown. You know, a lot of this makes sense. Certainly a lot of these points probably are where some of you guys farm right now, certainly around the Medicine Hat area and stuff. So this is now what it looks like. So I got this data from some geography folks with Ag Canada at Ottawa. And what they do is they do a crop survey every year. If you're on Twitter or familiar with some of the stuff, you'll see they'll post their maps usually in March or April. They can't really differentiate between a lot of crops, so when they show wheat, it's all wheat. The great thing with rye is most of the rye in Western Canada is fall rye, so I know that these specific red areas on here, I guess the mouse is sort of working here, this is where fall rye is predominantly grown. The neat thing about this is I can zoom right in and I could look at your farm and see what field you grow rye in. I know that much. Anyway, so it's kind of an interesting tool. It certainly helped me. I came on with Ag Canada about 4 years ago. I started breeding rye about 3 years ago and working on agronomy more recently than that. It helped me kind of get a handle on where rye is growing. And so this is pretty neat. The one thing I want to point out, if you remember the previous map, that was 1 year. There were a lot of dots there. This is basically 5 years of data. So what you can see here is that certainly there isn't as much rye growing in Western Canada as there used to be. These are the acres, the trends. You can see here, 1965, and the trend has been pretty steadily downwards. There's a lot of reasons for this. First and foremost, if you look back in the country guides, you know, people talked about novel ways to deal with weeds before we had herbicides and things like that. Rye was a very important rotational crop, okay? It's very competitive, so people would grow a season of rye that would take out some of the weeds that would free up then to grow wheat or something like that afterwards. Other valuable crops, so obviously canola, hybrid canola came on stream. A lot of the pulses became more widely grown, so that certainly was an issue. With the lack of acres, then that led to a decrease in kind of marketing options, so it became a chicken or the egg thing. So if we didn't have enough rye, they didn't want to use it. People weren't willing to grow it if there wasn't a market for it. So those are kind of the general trends. So this is pretty actually, you know, when you look at the slides I've shown so far, this is kind of a bad news story, right? It's kind of like, well, why would we grow it? There's no place to go with it. Well, you know, there's reasons for optimism for the crop. Really, there's kind of two things I'm going to talk about here. First is hybrids have been brought in from Europe. Okay, so two of the varieties have been supported for full registration in Western Canada, so now they're being sent around to growers. And you guys know this, that you can get some seed and grow some of the hybrids. They're quite interesting. And I'll talk about data of why these hybrids are interesting in a minute. There's been another variety supported for interim registration just this year. They'll go for full support this coming fall, this coming winter, and that there'll be 3 hybrids available probably for production. This is created, well, it's really the first example of a hybrid cereal out there. And so there's a lot of curiosity. There's been a lot of talk about hybrid wheat and barley. Those don't really currently exist. So hybrid rye is the best example of that. So people have been interested in it. Certainly the yield numbers make people interested. Then finally, some of the work by some of the seed companies have been kind of interesting, where they've actually tied some of the hybrid seed production and then to identity preserved programs, meaning that basically you grow the rye seed, you have an avenue then to market it. And certainly those programs are full, so it's quite interesting. The other reason why I'm quite interested or excited about rye and why there's some optimism is certainly the cover cropping market. So if you're familiar with what's going on in the US, there's been a real change in how people produce. They're still sticking in a large part to their corn and soybean rotation, but what they're doing is they're cover cropping in between those. So they take the corn or the soybeans off, and they'll plant rye into that in the fall. The nice thing about that is that it's a one-way street. So they plant it, spray it out, or mow it, or whatever, and then they go in with that crop afterwards. So they're not growing their own seed. They need a supply of seed. And so what you look at, so I can say the benefits here of cover cropping. Most of you might know this, but if you look up in this corner, this is the Canadian rye exports. So if you look at it, they're quite low. But more recently, this is, I believe, 2008, 2009. You can see they've shot up quite a bit. And the red is the North American market. So traditionally, they were kind of low, but with the cover cropping going on in the U.S., certainly, Ohio, Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, all those places, they're starting to talk about cover cropping, and they're needing seed, and a lot of that's coming from Canada. So there certainly is a draw for that. Why, you could say, well, big deal, is this really going to last? I can say, certainly from the surveys, it looks like it is going to, because only 8% of the cover cropping is associated with incentive payments. So guys aren't getting money just to do it, just to put money in their pocket. They're actually doing it because they see a benefit. So there is a yield bump in some of their soybeans and corn as a result of cover cropping. So winter cereals are typically used. Sometimes it's winter wheat. Sometimes they prefer to use rye or winter triticale. The issue is they can't always source them. So the idea is we grow a lot of rye here. Potentially it could be shipped down there. There's a direct market. Last fall, I was down at a conference in the US, and I was talking to a cover crop guy from Ohio. He said he had farmers telling me they were paying $17 a bushel for rye to seed it in, spray it out, and then go in with corn afterwards. So that's pretty remarkable. I think there is certainly a market there, and I certainly think that in Western Canada here, we're poised to fill that market. The key is to seize that, okay? Okay, so now I'm going to go into a little data to kind of look at comparisons between hybrid rye and open pollinated rye. And this is what's got people excited, okay? So this first set of data is generated through the fall rye registration trial. So what happens is a company like KWS, who has developed these hybrid varieties, comes to me and they said, we'd like to have these tested in Canada so we can get them supported for registration, which means then farmers have access to grow them. And so this is a trial that's pretty comprehensive. Typically the lines are in the trial for 2 years for interim registration or 3 years to get full support. And it's growing at 15 sites across Western Canada. So if you look here, there's a good cross-section of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. In order for these varieties to get supported, they have to be equivalent or better to the Czechs, okay? So just to show you here, basically the two varieties that were recently supported for registration were first tested in 2011, 2012. So this is basically percent yields relative to the mean of the checks. So when you take an average of the checks, this is how much better they were than that average. Okay, so you're seeing typically anywhere between kind of 25 to 40% increase in yield over open pollinated rye. So that's pretty impressive. You can see that why people got interested. Bono is now the one that they have supported for interim registration. You can see actually there's a yield jump from some of those. What I wanted to point out here, that the check mean, so open pollinated rye is no slouch itself actually if you manage it properly. That's the key. Okay, so what I want to point out here is the check mean is equivalent, so this is what it is in tons per hectare. When you translate it to bushels per acre under our management systems to the variety registration trial system, is that we're routinely getting, yields of, in the 90, kind of 75 to 90 bushel range. So if you manage it intensively enough, so we not like we lay excess nitrogen on, but we manage it like we think the trial should be managed, the yields can be quite good. The other thing I want to point out here, so this is the range of the yields within that year. This includes both open pollinated and hybrid rye. What I want to point out here is if you look at this, there are yields that are in the 13 tons per hectare range. This is coming off some of the hybrid rye. That's a lot. That's like you're talking 200 bushels then at that point. Okay, so that's pretty interesting, and this is what the data is showing, and this is why people are getting excited and trying some of this stuff out, okay? All right, so I just wanted to point out these are the hybrids and basically their yield potential. So the other information, so when KWS came in and they were putting through the system, they paired with one of the companies that has the rights to Brisetto, and basically they paired with Ducks Unlimited to try to get on-farm trials done. So these were done as a comparison generally between, well, it was a comparison between Hayslett and Brisetto across 7 locations in Western Canada. These were 20-acre strips that farmers did, okay? This is a summary of the data. So what you typically saw was about a 17% increase in yield. This is the average across all the sites. So some were higher, some were lower. So if you look at this data, actually, it's not actually really fantastic. And the reason for this, really, I think is the issue is people were treating rye like rye. Rye is one of those crops that, some people take care of it, but a lot of people just throw it out there. It'll soak up whatever residual nitrogen is there, and that's it. And they're fine with that, okay? So they were treating rye like rye. Further reason why I know this, so I might talk to the person like, no, we treat it normally. Some of these crops were in the field for longer than a year. So it was seeded in September and harvested in October. If you grow rye, you know that it matures quite early, and that really actually isn't necessarily, so they went and harvested other crops and came back to it finally. The other reason why I know this is that the falling numbers are extremely low. I'll point out later, but typically the hybrids, the falling numbers, I've seen falling numbers in the 400s. And so this meant that it was left out in the field for quite a while. Furthermore, they were sprouting. So I guess you look at this data, yes, you get the yield bump. Some of the grain quality benefits aren't necessarily there, but that was partly due to management, okay? So like I said, it was in the field over a year. Low falling numbers, sprouting were likely an issue. Also, if you notice here, there were some issues with ergot, so slightly over what the regulations are. Some of this could be, if you leave the crop out in the field, sometimes you'll see extra tillering involved. Late tillers generally get more ergot, that would drive things up. So I guess what I'm saying is this trial was interesting. It certainly showed what the yields can be in Western Canada, but I think if you're going to go with this hybrid crop, certainly the seed is more expensive. You need to manage it and kind of treat it and change your mindset on how you treat it, okay? So just to summarize what we know, hybrids out-yield open pollinateds, okay? That's kind of been shown in the data. The production practices vary widely across Western Canada. I've kind of learned this through communication with farmers in terms of what everybody tries, but also based on limited information from the Ducks Unlimited trial. What we don't know is why the hybrids out-yield open pollinated lines in Western Canada. So what specific avenues, what portions of the yield components that make up yield really differ between open pollinated and hybrid lines. And then what happens if we push the agronomic practices, actually both in the hybrids but also in the open pollinated? Where can we drive yields? So this came to the trial that we've kind of developed, and we have at a number of locations. This is not really a pure agronomic trial where we're going to develop nitrogen response curves or look at specific types of control. It's more of a demonstration and to try to get a handle on yield components, things like that. So it really is to look at the difference between open pollinated and hybrid lines. It's also to look at differences between kind of what I term as conventional management practices, so more minimal versus more intensive, where we kind of, give it the full groceries kind of deal. Okay, so it was at 6 locations: Lethbridge, Vauxhall, Medicine Hat, Indian Head, Melfort, and Brandon. The varieties were Hayslett, AC Rifle, Brisetto, and Gatineau. So that was kind of the mix. So we had 2 open pollinated lines, 2 hybrid lines kind of put together. It was planted in 2014, so that's the date I'm going to talk about now, and then also it's out in the field right now. So these are the treatments. We can quibble all we want about these treatments. Oh, that's not really how I manage it. I'm conventional versus intensive. This is kind of just how we laid it out, okay? I went from basically provincial recommendations kind of what they recommended, and that's really kind of how I came at with some of these recommendations. Some of these other ones then are more complete, so fungicide, really high levels of nitrogen, basically trying to push the yield to wherever we can go. All right, so bar graph, basically the hybrids are in blue and the open pollinated lines are in red. The dark blue bars are the conventional treatment and the light blue bars are the intensive treatment. Okay, so typically the trends across the data are that the open pollinated line, or the hybrid lines out-yield the hybrid lines out-yield the open pollinated lines. Typically we saw a response from the intensive management treatment. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit, but that's what it kind of looked like. So just to give you numbers, so I'm not going to go through each variety and determine which one did better. I wanted to look at this strictly from an OP versus a hybrid perspective, just to kind of give you the general idea of where the yield is coming from in the different kind of rye production systems, okay? So this is all converted in bushels per acre, okay? So we can kind of speak on a common term. This is the location, so Brandon, Indian Head, Lethbridge, Medicine Hat, Melfort, Vauxhall, and then the mean. This is the mean of all the trials, or the yield of the trials at those locations. So this is in bushels per acre. You can see at Lethbridge, so Lethbridge, of course, and Lethbridge and Vauxhall were under irrigation. So that explains certainly where some of the yields are. Pretty impressive for the hybrids, but also the open pollinated lines, that actually was pretty decent as well. You'd be happy with that, I think. These letters here kind of describe the differences. So basically the hybrid intensive treatment yielded the most on average across the sites. Then it was the conventional one, and the OP conventional versus intensive were very similar. The yields, there wasn't a huge yield response from that perspective. And so when you look at comparisons between a hybrid and open pollinated lines, essentially what you see is that there was a significant response, or there was a significant difference between those two systems at all locations. The conventional versus intensive management system, it was kind of split. Some of the sites didn't show response. This is partly due likely to the high residual nitrogen content that is in the soils, typically on research station sites. So basically we need to do a better job of picking our sites. But where we did see several of the sites did have a response, and I'll kind of break down some of that information so we know it. We didn't really see a variety by treatment interaction, which basically means that for the intensive, going from the conventional to the intensive treatment, that basically the varieties, or the hybrids and open pollinated lines, responded the same. So I'm just going to break down, what I mean by yield components. Okay, so this is breaking it down step by step to try to get basically, where we derive yield. So looking at the weight of one kernel. So when we look at this, so this is the data across all the locations that sent me the yield component data. So what we saw actually was there's a significant difference in seed size compared from the hybrids to the OPs. but there was no response from the conventional versus intensive management setting. Looking at the number of kernels per spike, so you need one seed weighs so much, then you have how many kernels per spike, so that's seed weight by the number of kernels per spike multiplied, okay? So when you look at that, what we found, again, significant increase in number of kernels per spike in the hybrids over the OP. So that's a fairly large jump actually there when you look at that. That is one of the more significant factors. It was not influenced in this study by management practice. The next is to look at tillering. So basically in a unit area, what was the seed weight, how many seeds per head, and then how many basically heads per unit area, you multiply it all up to get yield. What we found, there was a significant difference again for the number of heads per unit area in the hybrid versus the OP, but there was no influence between the conventional and intensive management practice. So it kind of adds up. I'll talk about this intentional versus management practice difference and kind of explain it a little more in a second, okay? So when you put that all together, you get grain yield. And basically what we found, which is interesting, is that there was a significant difference between hybrids and open pollinated lines, but actually also that the management practice did influence. When you put it all together, when you look at grain yield, there was a significant interaction with the conventional versus the intensive management practice, so there was a difference between the two. Just to break this down, I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you. I'm trying to kind of lay this out as clear as possible. But essentially, what I did here to try to make it so it's not just you know, a bunch of yield numbers and things that don't really make sense. I tried to explain, you know, basically the differences relative to one specific treatment. So what I did is I took the open pollinated lines, conventional, and I basically made that almost like the yield index that you look at in the seed guide, okay? So this is 0, okay? This is the baseline, and this is what everything was above it. So in this case, for 1,000 kernel weight at Brandon, you'll see that the hybrid under the intensive treatment, the 1,000 kernel weight was 11.4% higher than the open pollinated conventional treatment. Everybody kind of understand where that's coming from? So basically what I'm trying to get at is really the percentage increase over this specific treatment, just to kind of get a relative comparison, okay? So when you look at the overall mean, there was, between the conventional, or the hybrids and the OPs, there was an increase in seed size, okay? That's essentially what it tells you. What it tells you, actually, that it's interesting, that the conventional treatment, the seed size was slightly larger than the intensive one, which is kind of interesting, right? The kernels per head. So this is where the major jump is. So compared to the open pollinated conventional treatment, what we saw actually is that the hybrids in general had 20% more kernels per head. Okay, this is the big, and this has kind of been talked about in the literature. When you look at hybrid rye compared to open pollinated rye, the biggest yield gain is really in that head. Okay. But the thing to point out here is that it didn't really respond to the conventional versus intensive management treatment. So this is kind of fixed. You kind of get this open pollinated versus hybrid rye. That hybrid vigor, boom, is associated with a larger head, okay? More kernels per head. The interesting thing down here is, okay, and I guess I'll go through these. So like I said, there's a significant difference here, significant difference between the hybrid and the OP lines. And then I just wanted to point out that there was a significant difference in the heads per meter squared, so the differences between the hybrids and the OPs. But an interesting thing to point out here is if you look at this, so the conventional versus the intensive treatment, typically in all cases what you saw actually was a yield bump, or I guess the yield kind of from the intensive management treatment meant there was more heads per meter squared. And this is kind of an interesting thing. So I guess what I'm getting at and why I want to point this out, although it wasn't significant, it was very close to being significant, so numerically it was higher. But what I'm getting at is on your farm, likely the size of the head is pretty fixed, but what you could possibly drive through management practice is the amount of tillering. Okay, so that's kind of, I guess, the take-home point from this. So just to kind of summarize this, so the hybrids significantly out-yielded the open pollinated lines. Not all locations showed a significant response to intensive management. As I mentioned, it may have to do with high residual nitrogen. we tested for that, and certainly we saw that at Lethbridge and Vauxhall. So it was something that we couldn't really mitigate, I guess. The yield component analysis showed that the hybrids had significantly larger kernels and more kernels per head. Okay, so that was significant. However, differences in management practice had the highest influence on the number of tillers per unit area. So you're planting this stuff, if you want to change the amount of tillers or whatever, it certainly can be driven probably by intensive management practices and maybe more nitrogen. So now I'm going to talk about grain quality. This is one of the other big kind of calling card of the hybrids. So there wasn't really much of a difference between the hybrid and the open pollinated lines in terms of test weight. Ergot, there was. This is interesting. So hybrids versus OP. The OPs had significantly less ergot than the hybrids. And what's also interesting is the conventional versus intensive management practice actually showed a significant response there. And we'll talk about that in a minute. I'll just go through this table here. The falling numbers, as you can see, there was a significant difference between the hybrids and open pollinated lines. This is fairly large here. So if you look at, typically I think it's about 185 seconds or so to get onto milling grade for rye. While there wasn't too many issues in the open pollinated, certain locations like Melfort, the falling numbers are quite low. The hybrids, typically they were all above that. And then also the differences in protein, is relatively interesting. There's differences between the hybrids being lower than the OPs, and that was significantly affected by management practice, so nitrogen. But the interesting thing to point out here is when you look at a yield of protein on a hectare basis, so when you combine the percentage protein of the grain by the yield, what you found actually is that the amount of protein yield is actually still higher than the hybrid. So if you're thinking about feeding the stuff and care about protein percentage or anything like that, from a field-based perspective, you'll still actually get more of the hybrid. So it was kind of interesting. And that, of course, was also affected by the management practice. So as I mentioned, there's differences between the lines for the open pollinated and hybrid treatment versus also as well as the agronomic treatment. And then there also were some differences for protein and protein per hectare. So just to show some pictures, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the ergot data and try to break that down, just to kind of break up all these numbers and show you some nice pictures. This is kind of what the sclerotia, when it germinates, what it looks like in the field. So little tiny mushrooms poking out of the ground. Certainly you know what ergot looks like when it pokes out of the head. We separate it after we harvest it with a little color sorter, and typically we'll pick through it, and that's how we do it. So we have a 500-gram sample, we color sort it, pick out all the ergot, then we just basically take that weight, divide it by 500, and that tells us what the percentage of the ergot in the sample is. So breaking this down, this is what it looked like across locations. What you'll see is that there was a significant difference at two locations, so Brandon and Melfort. Differences between the hybrid versus the OP lines. There was nothing significantly different at Indian Head, Lethbridge, or Vauxhall. In fact, Vauxhall we had almost no ergot at all. That is likely due to the dry conditions we had there. So these are kind of typical, and this is kind of noted, I guess, when hybrid ryes were registered. They're numerically higher than the open pollinated lines for increased ergot, but they weren't statistically different. Typically, you can see from most locations there isn't an issue, but it can be something to consider. The one thing I really wanted to talk about here was how and why this was significant is the difference in management practice. Okay, so that's kind of an interesting one. Most people talk about, well, you can't spray fungicides. It's kind of what can you do? You can plow, you can mow around the outside of the field. Well, if we can drive some of this stuff with management practice, then that's something to kind of think about. So I want to go back to taking a look at basically what might be happening. So the reason when I talk to the collaborators, and certainly when you look at this data, what you see is an increase in the number of heads per meter squared. So there's more tillering, essentially, what that means, okay? So when you get more tillers, what that means is that actually the pollination may be drawn out over a longer period of time, okay? And so what that means is because rye is open pollinated, you really probably need a really large pulse of pollen, basically make sure every floret is pollinated, which limits the chance of actually spore or basically spores that are released from the ergot bodies that have germinated to land in the floret, okay? So if you have lots of pollen, they kind of compete, and this means that it'll actually be pollinated versus you know, an ergot spore causing honeydew and ergot sclerotia to be produced. So basically what we saw there at Indian Head was that there were actually quite a large amount of tillering, and that may have been where actually some of the ergot was actually produced. What it also showed is that in the intensive management practice, that the actual amount of tillers actually increased. So so that may actually be where the amount of tillering is coming. What I want to point out here is that in some of the other locations, they did have high amounts of tillering, like at Lethbridge and Vauxhall, but the issue was that those environments were quite dry, okay? So you kind of need this perfect storm of inoculum, moisture and temperature, as well as something that's susceptible. Well, there may be some levels of genetic resistance for ergot. The susceptibility in this case actually is kind of associated with the number of tillers, okay? So if you think about it, if you have a lot of tillers there isn't that amount of pollen, that actually makes the plant somewhat susceptible, and so that might be driving some of this. So I don't know if I'm being clear, but we can kind of talk about that a little bit more if you have questions. So basically, just to sum it up, this could be an interaction of moisture after heading and tillering associated with high fertility. Melfort and Indian Head had high amounts of rain throughout July, so this kind of outlines that. I don't have the yield components for Melfort, so when I get that information from them, when they send it to me, I'll run it through, and that may provide actually a clearer picture of what's going on. So that kind of sums up, I guess, the agronomy project of the summary from 1 year. I just wanted to point out some things to you. So I always get this question, so I figured I'd throw it in. How does rye or hybrid rye compare to things like winter wheat, triticale, or other things? So I had a trial out in the field. This is under irrigation. So this is typically what I saw from yields from a tons per hectare region. So this is kind of in the 170 bushel range for these. That's about 160. So you can see Hayslett and Prima were lower. This is a relative yield index, of Moats, winter wheat, and Hayslett as well. I should point that out. So these are probably things you're most interested in. We had winter wheat in there. So this shows basically the relative yield of these guys to Elevate and Moats. So you can see compared to winter wheat, there is a pretty large jump, as well as actually to the open pollinated rye. And you can see the winter survival is excellent, the heading dates, the differences, some of the agronomic things you guys might take into consider. I also wanted to point out here, so from my perspective, I also do a little work in winter triticale, and this is just kind of pump the tires of that, but to look at winter triticale compared to winter wheat and rye, typically what's out there isn't as similar to winter wheat or rye. But there is new material coming out that can yield quite well. This is the highest yielding stuff I've seen. It still can't touch the hybrid rye in terms of yield. So it's quite interesting. I also wanted to point out there's a lot of people kind of talking about corn these days. And Brian Fowler, who's the winter wheat breeder at Saskatchewan, kind of says, well, hybrid rye is our corn. Okay, so that's what he kind of says. And there certainly is some credence to this. So looking at the grain yields for corn at Lethbridge. So this is taken from last year. The average grain yield from the Corn Committee trials for Alberta was 9.1 tons per hectare. So certainly when you look at this, it certainly is competitive from that perspective. So it's just something to kind of think about before jumping on that bandwagon. So I just wanted to summarize things. The fall rye hybrids significantly out-yield the open pollinated varieties. The differences in grain yield potential of fall rye hybrids compared to the OP varieties is driven by all three grain yield components, with kernels per head being the most important. That's where the highest percentage difference was. The hybrids had significantly higher falling numbers. The open pollinated lines had lower percent ergot with the intensive management practice system actually having higher amounts of ergot. So that was just kind of the general trend there. Open pollinated varieties had higher protein in the grain, but the hybrids yielded more protein on a per hectare basis. So just to kind of round this up, this is a trial that's run at many locations, so there's a lot of people doing great work. So obviously Ken and Mike here at Farming Smarter are a part of this. the folks at Indian Head, Melfort, Brandon. I should really thank my crew at Lethbridge. They run 2 locations, but actually they were in on Sunday generating the data actually for some of this trial. So they work quite hard, and I'm really grateful for the effort they put in. And of course, there's funding partners here, WGRF, Ag Canada, Saskatchewan Winter Cereals Development Commission has put a fair bit of money into this project as well as into rye breeding, so they should be acknowledged. And that's essentially it. So if you have any questions, I don't know if we have time or if anybody has any questions about this.
If you increase your seeding rate on the intensive management, would that not reduce your tillage?
Yes, well, so this is the great question, right? And actually, Andy and I have discussed this a little bit. So we don't have a lot of information on that. And the interesting thing is that actually the hybrids, my understanding is that the recommended rate is actually quite a bit lower than that. It's actually instead of 250 like I have for this trial, it's kind of in the 175, 180 range. That's their recommended. So what we have planned, so we've submitted proposals to have this funded, is to look at seeding rates. And we'll break it down in similar yield components to see how much that can drive tillering. So you're exactly right. And that's, as soon as I looked at this data, I'm like, aha, well, that's likely it then. If we can decrease tillering and take advantage of that really large head, so you just get one really large head, that might be certainly a way to change, ergot susceptibility, but also drive yield. So there's some things to look at there. Yeah.
What is the magical plants per square foot in the fall?
Magical, couldn't tell you that. Honestly, I don't know. Honestly, don't know. From a seeding rate perspective, that work hasn't been done. So the recommendation is 250 seeds per meter squared, which is kind of in the range of 22 plants per square foot or something like that. Certainly if you look at the winter wheat agronomy, what they've been doing, they've been driving seeding rate like crazy, right? So they're up in the 350 seeds per meter squared, 400 range. I don't know if anybody's done that research to try to push rye up that high. Certainly there are growers that are talking about 2 bushels. I talked to them in that range. That's starting to get closer, and they certainly like that. But honestly, from a scientific perspective, to break it down, we don't have that information. Rye, it's a function of, there just isn't that much research in rye. And that's what I'm trying to get at, is that we need to do more and we'll learn more, and that'll help drive some of your decisions. So it's a great question, one we want to find out.
Holly was up from FP Genetics last week, and I was around at 19, and she thought it was definitely enough plants at 19 per foot, but she wouldn't give me the answer.
Yeah.
What are we shooting for? Yeah,
well, she doesn't know. They haven't done the research. I'll be very honest with you. So not that I know of that has anybody really done a broad range of seeding rate trials to really provide that magic number. Okay. Certainly with the hybrids, the cost of seed is expensive, so that drives some of that. But we don't know that, especially from Western Canada perspective.
I have 2 questions. When you went to that conference, did you get a phone number and a name for the guy who will pay $17 a bushel?
Yeah.
I know that actually the person was with Ohio State, and he was their extension person, and he's gone to the point that he's like, I'm going to go rye my farm to meet this demand. And what I've also had is that people from Minnesota contacting me and asking about rye because they're starting to do variety trials down there to try to learn. So I guess what I'm getting at is we need to meet that demand because they're already thinking about trying to meet that demand. And we grow rye here, let's meet that. So I don't have his contact information, but there's an opportunity for farmers in this area to meet that demand.
And the second question is, if I had winter wheat in Billings, Montana, and I knew the people in Ohio would pay $17 a bushel for a fall crop to covers, and I'm selling my winter wheat in Billings for $4 1/4, I think I'd be going to Ohio with my winter wheat. Yeah. But they're coming for fall rye instead.
That's a very good point. I mean, there's lots of winter wheat growing in and around the Great Lakes, right? And that's typically what they're using because it's available and it's cheap. What they need is a source of rye. That's what they want to use, right? But they can't get it. If you have to pay $17 a bushel, I mean, holy smokes. Yeah. Thanks.
I have a quick question. I saw that Bart Glenn said that fall rye is the rock star of cereal. So does that make you the Tommy Lee of cereal breeders? Well, join me in thanking Jamie.